So good morning, everybody, and apologies from me to all of you that I cannot be there with you this morning. However, please remember that at 3 o'clock your time, I will be available online, and please, if you would like to log in and do some role plays, I'm more than happy to meet with you. So 3 o'clock, and I will put that into a session as well. So today we're moving into element 4, which is about completing reports and documentation. Again, some of this information might be a little bit repeated to you because we have been going over a few things and layering on top of our knowledge and skill as we've been going. We're looking at 4A and 4B, which is maintain confidentiality and privacy and comply with reporting requirements. So I thought while we're looking at this, one apt slide to start us off with, looking at privacy, security and confidentiality and how it all literally goes together, because you cannot have one without the other in this space. So how are we going to maintain confidentiality and privacy? We need to be able to understand that a person's ability to control access to of others to themselves. We need to be able to know what their space looks like and what their possessions are, including information about them. In the world that we live today, there is no space for us to be able to disclose any information about any third party. And privacy also means taking those steps to avoid embarrassment and humiliation. So confidentiality is around the data or the information, not the person, and it refers to managing access to private information. Confidentiality provisions restricts an individual or an organization from using or disclosing information about a person that is outside of the scope for which that information was collected, and it is taken very seriously in today's environment. How do we collect some of this information, or what information is it that we need to keep confidential? Anything whatsoever that we collect. You would have heard me say in the past that you don't collect or ask questions or store information that you do not need to know the answer to. If you don't need information, don't request it. So you only ever gather information that is valid and relevant to the source of your work role at any given time. You also need to be very clear about how long and how you store that information. And on top of that, you need to know how to destroy it and who has access to this information other than yourself. Each of one of those areas is something that you potentially need to also explain to a client. And depending on how you work and who you work for, that may shift and change as well. So looking at a disclosure here around privacy and confidentiality. If you're discussing a person's situation, you absolutely need to be aware of maintaining their privacy. Sometimes if you're discussing their situation with them, you need to be aware of the environment that you're having that conversation, because if people can overhear the conversation, you have to ask yourself, who is it that can overhear? You need to be able to protect every confidential detail that you gather from a client, and you always need to know, or you always need to have a person's consent if you wish to talk about their situation to a third party, and that goes with referrals as well. So you need to sign consent for that, and most of the time people are happy to do that, but every now and again they aren't, so you cannot assume that they are willing to comply in that space. Maintaining confidentiality is part of respecting that person's privacy and their individual rights, as well as it being a legal requirement. In practice, confidentiality means not discussing anything about that individual, any of their personal information that you have, unless they've given you their consent. And a disclosure is the requirement in some exceptional situations to disclose private information. But this is generally only when you become aware that someone may be harmed. So, for example, the classic privacy and confidentiality statement that I say to all of my clients when I meet them is everything that they say to me will remain confidential. However, if they say anything that would reflect that they are at risk of harming themselves or a third party, I am duty bound to report that. And I make sure every single one of my clients clearly understands that, because that ensures their safety as well as mine. Because if a client suddenly discloses something to you and you haven't thoroughly told them how you're going to react to something, then you potentially have set them up for a misunderstanding around what is likely to happen for them. A classic example is, imagine if you're working with a client and the client's really angry and they say to you, oh, I'm just going to go down the road and shoot the newspaper man. You can't keep that confidential. You have to disclose that information. And they need to be aware that if they say anything remotely like that to you, that you have a responsibility to society to pass that information on. Which brings us around to the legal side of this. So you've got the Privacy Act of 1988. Now, please take notice of the way that that is written. If you refer to the Privacy Act in any of your assignments, please make sure that the actual wording, Privacy Act 1988, is in italics. The word "the" that prefixes that isn't in italics, and you always have to put in brackets a capital C, a capital T, and a capital C, a lowercase t, and a lowercase h, close brackets, and that's not in italics either. So if you are referring to one of the acts, please make sure you write them correctly. So 1988 Privacy Act outlines the principles for handling personal information that applies to Australian government departments as well as private sector organisations throughout Australia. If you work for an organisation, they have to follow that. It should be embedded into your policies and procedures so as you know exactly what your expectation is as a worker and how to store your client's information. On top of that, every single state and territory will have their own governing laws as well. So privacy and legislation and the principles that govern that collection, use and storage of people's information may very well shift and change depending on where you're working. And that incorporates quite a lot of other areas as well, which we're going to look at further into this session today. So any information that could identify a person must be kept confidential, and this can be names, addresses, dates of birth, descriptions, or identifying any of the attributes. You only have to look at the world that we live in today. Look at what has just happened to Medibank. Look at what's just happened to Optus. So cyber stalking and hacking and things like that. The people that do that are getting cleverer and cleverer, and we need to make sure that the information that we store of our clients is safe and secure. And if somebody can hack into Medibank, and I've worked for Medibank, so I know what their security levels are like, and that's enormous. So if somebody can hack into there, then we need to be aware that every single one of us is quite vulnerable. Some of the guidelines: ensure that you have a valid reason and the person's consent for collecting, storing, or distributing any personal information. Preferably signed consent. You cannot do a referral without getting a client signed consent. Keep their personal information in a locked filing cabinet that is fireproof, and any password protected electronic files with a high security relevant firewall. Limit the access to the files and the information, and only ever allow people that have a need to be able to view that information. So anybody else is restricted from being able to view that. And written records, for the most part, should never be removed from an organisation's grounds. So if you happen to be doing a home visit somewhere, preferably don't take their personal file with you, because that again can potentially cause a risk attached to that. And make sure you follow your organisation's policies and procedures all the way through. Which kind of brings us very, very nicely into compliance and understanding your organisation's compliance policies is first and foremost, because if your organisation is doing the right thing, they're actually following the legal side of everything, and so it trickles down. And if you're following that, you should be doing the right by your clients. Which brings us then into looking at complying with reporting requirements. And sometimes we need to be able to report any documentation requirements, for example, in aged care, disability care, and home community care settings. And it can be extensive. In a counselling environment, if you're working in that space, again, it sits under those same banners. And there's 3 important legal reasons why we need to have accurate record keeping. First and foremost, it's communication between the staff. If the records are not clear and they are not concise, there can be an avenue for error. And we cannot afford for that to happen, because that can actually move into spaces of potential neglect or again, abuse, depending on what it is that has happened through that lack of communication. We also need to be able to provide evidence that we're following all of the standards, and all written documentation is going to be part and parcel of that process. So for some of the things here, would be passing on documentation regarding changes in an individual's care plan. It could be an incident report or handover records, which may also assist in meeting that individual's duty of care requirements. Some of these documents are there to provide evidence of action that you've actually taken in the event of an incident or an accident. And of course, many organisations nowadays are funded, and if there is an organisation that's funded, it means that that organisation also has to meet the funding requirements, as well as following the funding requirement policies and procedures, which is written into their agreement. So there's another area of compliance that needs to be absolutely followed. So those are the 3 main areas, and every single one of those involves documentation. How do we report? You need to be aware of how to report any changes to any person's needs. And when you work with human beings, there normally is change that's going to take place. Following your workplace policy and procedures should point you thoroughly in the right direction. If you cannot find the information or you're unsure, reach out to a colleague or your supervisor. Any of the formal reports involve completing the formal procedures, such as an incident report. Sometimes it's a monitoring form or case notes or something that you have seen, heard, or have concerns about. All of these things need to be put in writing. Then they cannot just be verbally passed on. And the sooner you do this, the better. Any of those informal reporting usually involves literally communicating to your colleagues or your supervisors. And if you're in doubt, do it informally to your supervisor and ask them what they think that you should be doing, because they should be telling you if it needs to be in writing or not. Some of the ways that we're going to report, we might do it verbally, we might do it in person, we might do it in writing. And obviously writing can be electronic as well as handwritten. Either way, all of these reporting, if you do it verbally, it needs to be in a safe space where nobody that has no right to hear what you're saying can overhear it. If it's in person, it's normally done through meetings, which is going to be arranged. And then if it's in writing, be it electronic or handwritten, it needs to be stored correctly. So breaking that down just a little bit more, when it comes to a verbal report, you need to remember that that can be on the phone, it can be in person. We still keep notes or file notes on what we've reported. And if you are working in an aged care facility, for example, you will need to add an extra file note or onto that person's file. If you're working in the community, you will need to keep a note in your diary or in a folder on your computer. Always date, always sign all of your file notes. And remember that if you are going to cross something out, don't use whiteout, don't scribble it out so nobody can see what's underneath. Make sure you put a line through it, you write what you want to, what that change is above it, and you sign and you initial it and date it. Some of the information, details or the facts of what's happened, information of where any incident took place, dates and times, and who was involved in action taken by you or a third party. Again, all this information needs to be collated and stored. And then your written reports, they're going to be potentially case notes or progress notes. It could be information jotted into a communication book or an incident report. Any of these will have their own style and preferred way of communicating information. And it's important that you only ever record the facts. It isn't what you think, it is only what the facts are, because that becomes subjective. So you need to make sure that you're very precise around your case notes and any other notes that you may do. Things that you're going to need to add in there is your full name, your place of work, date and time of the issue, date and time the report was made, any of the actions that you took, any actions that anybody else took, details of what happened or what the issue was, and facts rather than just your ideas. Make sure it absolutely just remains a factual document, because if you go off on any of the other areas, then potentially you could very well get a bit lost. All right, and lastly, we're looking again at mandatory reporting. And I think I may have even said to you last week, by the end of the 12 weeks, you will be 100% brainwashed with mandatory reporting, because some people have to they have to report because they're mandated to. Please remember, it depends on your work role. It depends on whereabouts in Australia that you live, because different states and territories have different ways of reporting. The difference between mandatory reporting and being morally and ethically obligated to report is the fact that if a mandated person doesn't report, they're potentially going to be facing a jail sentence because it's a criminal act. Anybody else that is morally and obligated to report, it isn't a criminal offence. So that's mainly the difference. However, you do need to be aware of what you need to do where you live. And a classic example of that is the fact that in the Northern Territory, it's now mandated by law that any adult who suspects any type of child abuse on reasonable grounds must make a report to the police or relevant government body. So that is, everybody becomes a mandated reporter. And this is something that we need to know and that we need to be aware of. Now, if any of you want to find out any more information around that, the link is at the bottom of here. Please feel free to check it out, have a look. It's quite interesting to look at the differences between the different states and territories. So that brings us to the end of our session today. And we are now, like I said, on week 10, so we've only got a couple of weeks left now, and I'm sure that you're all very busy doing assignments and role play assessments. So don't forget, 3 o'clock Eastern States Times, I will be logged in, and you can come and visit me if you want to practice some role plays. In the meantime, if you have any messages or any questions, please send me an email or log in this afternoon, and we can catch up then. Please take care, stay safe, and I will see you soon. All right, bye for now.